I feel it right to warn the reader that he can very well skip this chapter without losing the thread of such story as I have to tell, since for the most part it's nothing more than the account of a conversation that I had with Larry. I should add, however, that except for this conversation, I should perhaps not have thought it worthwhile to write this book. That autumn, a couple of months after Elliot's death, I spent a week in Paris on my way to England. Isabel and Gray, after their grim journey to Italy, had returned to Brittany, but were now once more settled in the apartment in Rue Saint-Guillaume. She told me the details of his will. He had left a sum of money for masses to be said for his soul in the church he had built, and further some for its upkeep. He had bequeathed a handsome amount to the Bishop of Nice to be spent on charitable purposes. He had left me the equivocal legacy of his 18th century pornographic library and a beautiful drawing of Fragonard of Satyr engaged with a nymph on a performance that is usually conducted in private. It was too indecent to hang on my walls, and I am not one to gloat upon obscenity in private. He had provided generously for his servants. His two nephews were to have $10,000 each, and the residue of his estate went to Isabel. What this amounted to, she did not tell me, and I did not inquire. I gathered from her complacency that it was quite a lot of money. For long, ever since he had regained his health, Gray had been impatient to go back to America and get to work again, and though Isabel was comfortable enough in Paris, his restlessness had affected her too. He had for some time been in the communication with his friends, but the best opening that presented itself was contingent on his putting in a considerable amount of capital that he had not got. But Elliot's death had put Isabel in a possession of very much more than was needed, and Gray, with her approval, was starting negotiations with the view, if everything turned out as well as it was presented, of leaving Paris and going to look into the matter for himself. But before that was possible, there was much to attend to. He had to come to a reasonable agreement with the French Treasury over the inheritance tax. They had to get rid of the house at Antibes and the apartment in Rue Saint-Guillaume. They had to arrange for a sale at the Hotel de Rouse for Elliot's furniture, pictures, and drawings. These were valuable, and it seemed wise to wait till spring, when the great collectors were likely to be in Paris. Isabel was not sorry to spend another winter there. The children by now could chatter French as easily as they could chatter English, and she was glad to let them have a few more months at a French school. They had grown in 3 years and were now long-legged, skinny, vivacious little creatures, with little at present of their mother's beauty, but with nice manners and an insatiable curiosity. So much for that. I met Larry by chance. I had asked Isabel about him, and she told me that since their return from Le Bal, they had seen little of him. She and Gray had by now made a number of friends for themselves, people of their own generation, and they were more often engaged than during the pleasant weeks when the four of us were so much together. One evening I went to the Theatre Francois to see Bernice. I had read of it, of course, but never seen it played, and since it's seldom given, I was unwilling to miss the opportunity. It's not one of Racine's best plays, for the subject is too tenuous to support 5 acts, but it's moving and contains passages that are justly famous. The story is founded on a brief passage in Tacitus, who loved Bernice, queen of Palestine, with passion, and who had even, as was supposed, promised her marriage, for reasons of state sent her away from Rome during the first days of his reign, in despite of his desires and in despite of hers. For the Senate, the people of Rome were violently opposed to their emperor's alliance with a foreign queen. The play is concerned with the struggle in his breast between love and duty, and when he falters, it is Bernice who, in the end, assured that he loves her, confirms his purpose, and separates herself from him forever. I suppose only a Frenchman can appreciate to the full the grace and grandeur of Racine and the music of his verse, but even a foreigner, once he has accustomed himself to the periwiggled formality of the style, can hardly fail to be moved by its passionate tenderness and the nobility of his sentiment. Racine knew, as few have done, how much drama is contained in the human voice. To me, at all events, the role of these mellifluous Alexandrines is sufficient substitute for action, and I find the long speeches worked up with infinite skill to the expected climax, every bit as thrilling as any hair-raising adventure of the movies. There was an interval after the third act, and I went out to smoke a cigarette in the foyer over which presides Houdon's Voltaire with his toothless, sardonic grin. Someone touched me on the shoulder. I turned around, perhaps with a slight movement of annoyance, for I wanted to be left with the exultation with which those Serenus lines had filled me, and saw Larry. As always, I was glad to see him. It was a year since I had set my eyes on him, and suggested that at the end of the play we should meet and have a glass of beer together. Larry said he was hungry, for he had no dinner, and proposed that we should go to Montmartre. We found one another in due course and stepped out into the open. The Theatre Francois had a musty fog that is peculiar to it. It is impregnated with the body odor of those unnumbered generations of sour-faced, unwashed women called ouvresses, who show you to your seat and domineeringly await their tip. It was a relief to get into the fresh air, and since the night was fine, we walked. The arc lamps in the Avenue de l'Opera glared so defiantly that the stars above, as though too proud to compete, shrouded their brightness in the dark of their infinite distance. As we walked, we spoke of the performance we had just seen. Larry was disappointed. He would have liked it to be more natural, the lines spoken as people naturally speak, and the gestures less theatrical. I thought his point of view mistaken. It was rhetoric, magnificent rhetoric, and I had a notion that it should be spoken rhetorically. I liked the regular thump of the rhymes and the stylized gestures handed down in a long tradition seemed to me to suit the temper of that formal act. I could not but think that was how Racine would have wished his play to be played. I had admired the way in which the actors had contrived to be human, passionate, and true within the limitations that confined them. Art is triumphant when it can use conviction as an instrument in its own purpose. We reached the Avenue de Clichy, went into the Brasserie Gaffe. It was not long past midnight and the room was crowded, but we found a table and ordered ourselves eggs and bacon. I told Larry I had seen Isabel. "Gray will be glad to get back to America," he said. "He's a fish out of water here. He won't be happy till he's at work again. I dare say he'll make a lot of money. If he does, it'll be due to you. You not only cured him in body, but in spirit as well. You restored his confidence in himself." I did very little. I merely showed him how to cure himself. "How did you learn to do that?" "By accident. It was when I was in India. I'd been suffering from insomnia and happened to mention it to an old yogi I knew, and he said he'd soon settle that. He did just what you saw me do with Gray, and that night I slept as I hadn't slept for months. And then a year later it must have happened. I was in the Himalayas with an Indian friend of mine. He sprained his ankle. It was impossible to get a doctor, and he was in great pain. I thought I'd try to do what the old yogi had done, and it worked. You can believe it or not, he was completely relieved of the pain." Larry laughed. "I can assure you, no one was more surprised than I. There's nothing to it, really. It only means presenting the idea into the sufferer's mind." Easier said than done. "Would it surprise you if your arm raised itself onto the table without any volition of yours?" "Very much." "It will. My Indian friend told people what I'd done when we got back to civilization, and he brought others to see me. I hated doing it because I couldn't quite understand it, but they insisted. Somehow or other, I did them good. I found I was able to relieve people not only of pain, but of fear. It's strange how many people suffer from it. I don't mean fear of closed spaces and fear of heights, but fear of death, and what's worse, fear of life. Often there are people who seem in the best of health, prosperous without any worry, and yet they're tortured by it. I've sometimes thought it was the most besetting humor of men, and I asked myself at one time if it was due to some deep animal instinct that man had inherited from that primeval something that first felt the thrill of life. I was listening to Larry with expectation, for it was not often that he spoke at any length, and I had an inkling that for once he felt communicative. Perhaps the play we just seen had released some inhibition, and the rhythm of its sonorous cadences, as music will, had overcome his instinctive reserve. Suddenly I realized that something was happening to my hand. I had not given another thought to Larry's half-laughing question. I was conscious that my hand no longer rested on the table, but it was raised an inch above without any of my willing it. I was taken aback. I looked at it and saw that it trembled slightly. I felt a queer tingling in the nerves of my arm, a little jerk, and my hand and forearm lifted of themselves. I, to the best of my belief, neither aiding nor resisting until they were several inches from the table. Then I felt my whole arm being raised from the shoulder. "This is very odd," I said. Larry laughed. I made the slightest effort of will, and my hand fell back onto the table. "It's nothing," he said. "Don't attach any importance to it. You were taught that by the yogi you spoke of about when you first came back from India?" Oh, no, he had no patience with that kind of thing. I don't know whether he believed that he possessed the powers that some yogis claim to have, but he would have thought it puerile to exercise them. Our eggs and bacon arrived, and we ate them with good appetite. We drank our beer. Neither of us spoke. Larry was thinking of I knew not what, and I was thinking of him. We finished. I lit a cigarette, and he lit a pipe. "What made you go to India in the first place?" I asked abruptly. "Chance. At least I thought so at the time. Now, I'm inclined to think it was the inevitable outcome of my years in Europe. Almost all the people who've had most effect on me I seem to have met by chance. Yet, looking back, it seems as though I could but have met them. It's as if they were waiting there to be called upon when I needed them. I went to India because I wanted to rest. I'd been working very hard and wished to sort out my thoughts. I got a job as a deckhand in one of those pleasure cruise ships that go around the world. It was going to the east and through the Panama Canal to New York. I hadn't been to America for 5 years, and I was homesick. I was depressed. You know how ignorant I was when we first met in Chicago all those years ago. I'd read an awful lot in Europe and seen a lot, but I was no nearer than when I started to when I was looking for. I wanted to ask him what that was, but had a feeling that he'd just laugh and shrug his shoulders and say it was a matter of no consequence. "But why did you go as a deckhand?" I asked instead. "You had money." "I wanted the experience. Whenever I got waterlogged spiritually, whenever I absorbed all I can for the time, I felt it useful to do something of that sort. That winter, after Isabel and I broke off our engagement, I worked in a coal mine near Lens for 6 months. It was then that he told me of those incidents that I had narrated in the previous chapter. Were you sore when Isabel threw you over?" Before he answered, he looked at me for some time with those strangely black eyes of his that seemed then to look inward rather than out. "Yes. I was very young. I'd made up my mind that we were going to marry. I'd made plans for the life that we were going to lead together. I expected it to be lovely." He laughed faintly. "But it takes two to make a marriage, just as it takes two to make a quarrel." It had never occurred to me that the life I offered Isabel was a life that filled her with dismay. If I'd had any sense, I'd never have suggested it. She was too young and ardent. I couldn't blame her. I couldn't yield. It's just possible that the reader will remember on his flight from the farm after that grotesque encounter with the farmer's widowed daughter-in-law, he had gone to Bonn. I was anxious to get him to continue, but knew I must be careful not to ask more direct questions than I can help. "I've never been to Bonn," I said. "When I was a boy, I spent some time as a student in Heidelberg. It was, I think, the happiest time of my life. I liked Bonn. I spent a year there. I got a room in the house of the widow of one of the professors at the university who took in a couple of boarders. She and her 2 daughters, both of them middle-aged, did the cooking and the housework. I found my fellow boarder was a Frenchman, and I was disappointed at first because I wanted to speak nothing but German. But he was an Alsatian, and he spoke German, if not more fluently, with a better accent than he spoke French. He was dressed like a German pastor, and I was surprised to find out, after a few days, that he was a Benedictine monk. He had been granted leave from the absence of his monastery to make researches at the university library. He was a very learned man, but he didn't look at it any more than he looked like my idea of a monk. He was a tall, stout fellow with sandy hair, prominent blue eyes, and a red, round face. He was shy and reserved and didn't seem to want to have anything much to do with me. But he was very polite in a rather elaborate way and always took a civil part in the conversation at table. I only saw him then. As soon as we had finished dinner, he went back to work at the library, and after supper, when I sat in the parlor improving my German with whichever of the two daughters wasn't washing up, he retired to his room. I was surprised when one afternoon, after I'd been there at least a month, he asked me if I'd care to walk with him. He said he could show me places in the neighborhood that he didn't think I'd be likely to discover for myself. I'm a pretty good walker, but he could outwalk me any day. We must have covered a good 15 miles on that first walk. He asked me what I was doing in Bonn, and I said I'd come to learn German and to get to know something about German literature. He talked very intelligently. He said he'd be glad to help me in any way he could. After that, we went for walks 2 or 3 times a week. I discovered that he'd taught philosophy for some years. When I was in Paris, I'd read a certain amount, Spinoza and Plato and Descartes, but I hadn't read any of the great German philosophers, and I was only too glad to listen while he talked about them. One day, when we'd made an excursion around the Rhine and were sitting in a beer garden drinking a glass of beer, he asked me if I was a Protestant. I suppose so, I said. He gave me a quick look, and I thought I saw in his eyes that glimmer of a smile. He began to talk about Aeschylus. I'd been learning Greek, and he knew the great tragedians, and I could never hope to know them. It was inspiring to hear him. I wondered why he had suddenly asked me that question. My guardian, Uncle Bob Nelson, was an agnostic, but we went to church regularly because his patients expected it of him, and sent me to Sunday school for the same reason. Martha, our help, was a rigid Baptist, and she used to frighten my childhood by telling me of the hellfire to which the sinner would be condemned to all eternity. She took a real delight in picturing to me the agonies of what would be endured by the various people in the village whom, for some reason or other, she had it in for. By winter, I'd got to know the Father Edge-Somerset very well. I think he was rather a remarkable man. I never saw him vexed. He was good-natured and kindly, far more broad-minded than I would have expected, and wonderfully tolerant. His erudition was prodigious, and he must have known how ignorant I was. But he used to talk to me, and though I was learned as he was very patient with me. He seemed to want nothing to be of service to me. One day, I don't know why, I had an attack of lumbago, and Frau Grabau, my landlady, insisted on putting me to bed with hot water bottles. Father Edge-Somerset, hearing I was laid up, came into my room to see me after supper, except that I was in a good deal of pain. I felt perfectly well. You know what bookish people are. They're inquisitive about books. And as I put down the book I was reading when he came in, he took it up and looked at the title. It was a book about Meister Eckhart that I found at the bookseller in the town. He asked me why I was reading it, so I said that I'd been going through a certain amount of mystical literature and told him about Costi and how he'd aroused my interest in the subject. He surveyed me with his prominent blue eyes, and there was a look in them that I can only describe as amused tenderness. I had the feeling that he found me rather ridiculous, but felt so much loving kindness toward me that he didn't like me any the less. Anyhow, I've never much minded if people thought me a bit of a fool. "What are you looking for in these books?" he asked me. "If I knew that," I answered, "I'd at least be on the way to finding it." "Do you remember my asking if you were a Protestant? You said you supposed so. What did you mean by that?" "I was brought up as one," I said. "Do you believe in God?" he asked. I don't like personal questions, and my first impulse was to tell him that it was no business of his. But there was so much goodness in his aspect that I felt impossible to affront him. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to answer yes, and I didn't want to answer no. It may have been the pain I was suffering that enabled me to speak, or it may have been something in him. Anyhow, I told him about myself. Larry hesitated for a moment, and when he went on, I knew he wasn't speaking to me, but to the Benedictine monk. He had forgotten me. I don't know what there was in the time or the place that enabled him to speak without my prompting of what his natural reticence had so long concealed. Uncle Bob Nelson was very democratic, and he sent me to high school at Maugham. It was only because Louisa Bradley nagged him into that when I was 14. He let me go to St. Paul's. I wasn't very good at anything, either at work or games, but I fitted in all right. I think I was an entirely normal boy. I was crazy about aviation. Those were the early days of flying, and Uncle Bob was as excited about it as I was. He knew some of the airmen, and when I said I wanted to learn to fly, he said he'd fix it for me. I was tall for my age, and when I was 16, I could easily pass for 18. Uncle Bob made me a promise to keep it a secret because he knew everyone would be down on him like a ton of bricks for letting me go. But as a matter of fact, he helped me get over to Canada and gave me a letter to someone he knew, and the result was that by that time I was 17, I was flying in France. They were terrible, grim-cracked planes. We flew in them, and you practically took your life in your hands each time you went up. The heights we got to were absurd, judged by present standards, but we didn't know any better and thought it wonderful. I loved flying. I couldn't describe the feeling it gave me. I only knew I felt proud and happy. In the air, way up, I felt that I was part of something very great and very beautiful. I didn't know what it was all about. I only knew that I wasn't alone anymore, by myself as I was, 2,000 feet up, but that I belonged. I can't help if it sounds silly. When I was flying above the clouds and they were like an enormous flock of sheep below me, I felt that I was at home with infinitude. Larry paused. He gazed at me from the caverns of his impenetrable eyes, but I did not know whether he saw me. I'd known that men had been killed by the 100,000, but I hadn't seen them killed. It didn't mean very much to me. Then I saw a dead man with my own eyes. The sight filled me with shame. Shame? I exclaimed involuntarily. Shame because that boy, he was only 3 or 4 years older than me, who had had so much energy and daring, who, a moment before, had so much vitality, who'd been so good, was now just mangled flesh that looked as if it had never been alive. I didn't say anything. I had seen dead men when I was a medical student, and I had seen many more during the war. What had dismayed me was how trifling they looked. There was no dignity in them, marionettes that the showmen had thrown into the discard. I didn't sleep that night. I cried. I wasn't frightened for myself. I was indignant. It was the wickedness of that broke me. The war came to an end. and I went home. I'd always been keen on mechanics, and if there was nothing doing in aviation, I'd intended to get into automobile factory. I'd been wounded and had to take it easy for a while. Then they wanted me to go to work. I couldn't do the sort of work they wanted me to do. It seemed futile. I'd had a lot of time to think. I kept on asking myself what life was for. After all, it was only by luck that I was alive. I wanted to make something of myself, but I didn't know what. I'd never thought much about God. I began to think about him now. I couldn't understand why there was evil in the world. I knew I was very ignorant. I didn't know anyone I could turn to, and I wanted to learn. So I began to read at haphazard. When I told Father Ensham all this, he asked me, "Then you've been reading for 4 years? Where have you got?" "Nowhere," I said. He looked at me with such an air of radiant benignity that I was confused. I didn't know what I'd done to rouse so much feeling in him. He softly drummed his fingers on the table as though he were turning a notion over in his mind. "Our wise old church," he said then, "has discovered that if you will act as if you believed, belief will be granted to you. If you pray with doubt, but pray with sincerity, your doubt will be dispelled. If you will surrender yourself to the beauty of that liturgy, the power of which over the human spirit has been proved by the experience of the ages, peace will descend upon you. I am returning to my monastery in a little while. Why don't you come and spend a few weeks with us? You can work in the fields with our lay brothers. You can read in our library. It will be an experience no less interesting than working in a coal mine or on a German farm." "Why do you suggest it?" I asked. "I've been observing you for 3 months," he said. "Perhaps I know you better than you know yourself. The distance that separates you from faith is no greater than the thickness of a cigarette paper." I didn't say anything of that. It gave me a funny sort of feeling, as though someone had got a hold of my heartstrings and were giving them a tug. "At last," I said, "I think about it." He dropped the subject. For the rest of Father Ensheim's stay in Bonn, we never spoke of anything connected with religion again. But as he was leaving, he gave me the address of his monastery and told me if I made up my mind to come, I had only write him a line and he'd make arrangements. I missed him more than I expected. The year wore on, and it was midsummer. I liked it well enough in Bonn. I read Goethe and Schiller and Heine. I read Hölderlin and Reich. Still, I wasn't getting anywhere. I thought a lot about what Father Isham had said, and at last I decided to accept his offer. He met me at the station. The monastery was in Alsace, and the country was pretty. Father Ensheim presented me to the abbot and then showed me to the cell that had been assigned to me. It had a narrow iron bed, a crucifix on the wall, and by the way of furniture, only the barest necessities. The dinner bell rang, and I made my way to the refectory. It was a huge vaulted chamber. The abbot stood at the door with 2 monks, one of whom held a basin and the other a towel, and the abbot sprinkled a few drops of water on the hands of the guests, by way of washing them and dried them with a towel. One of the 2 monks handed him. There were 3 guests beside myself, 2 priests who were passing that way and had stopped off for dinner, and an elderly, grouchy Frenchman who was making a retreat. The abbot and the 2 priors, senior and junior, sat at the head of the room, each at his separate table. The father along 2 sides of the walls, while the novice, the lay brothers, and the guests sat at tables in the middle. Grace was said, and we ate. A novice took up his position near the refectory door, and a monotonous voice read from an edifying work. When we had finished, grace was said again. The abbot, Father Einsham, the guests, and the monk in charge of them went into a small room where we had coffee and talked of casual things. Then I went back to my cell. I stayed there 3 months. I was very happy. The life exactly suited me. The library was good and I read a great deal. None of the fathers tried in any way to influence me, but they were glad to talk to me. I was deeply impressed by their learning, their piety, and their unworldliness. You mustn't think it was an idle life they led. They were constantly occupied. They farmed their own land and worked it themselves, and they were glad to have my help. I enjoyed the splendor of the services, but the one I liked best was all the matins. It was at 4 a.m. It was wonderfully moving to sit in the church with the night all around you while the monks, mysterious in their habits, their cowls drawn over their heads, sang with their strong male voices the plain song of the liturgy. There was something reassuring in the regularity of the daily round, and notwithstanding all the energy that was displayed, notwithstanding the activity of thought, you had an abiding sense of repose. Larry smiled a trifle ruefully. Like Rolla, I've come too late in this world, too old. I should have been born in the Middle Ages, when faith was a matter of course. Then my way would have been clear to me, and I'd have sought to enter the order. I couldn't believe. I wanted to believe, but I couldn't believe in a God who wasn't better than the ordinary decent man. The monks told me that God had created the world for his glorification. That didn't seem to me a very worthy object. Did Beethoven create his symphonies for his glorification? I don't believe it. I believe he created them because the music in his soul demanded expression, and then all he tried to do was to make them as perfect as he knew how. I used to learn to the monks, repeating the Lord's Prayer. I wondered how they could continue to pray without misgiving to their Heavenly Father who gave them the daily bread. Do children beseech their earthly Father to give them subsistence? They expect him to do it. They neither feel nor need to feel gratitude to him for doing it. And we have only blame for a man who brings children into the world that he can't or won't provide for. It seemed to me that if an omnipotent creator was not prepared to provide his creatures with the necessities of existence, material and spiritual, he'd have done better not to create them. Dear Larry, I said, I think it's just as well you weren't born in the Middle Ages. You'd undoubtedly have perished at the stake. He smiled. You've had a great deal of success, he went on. Do you want to be praised to your face? It only embarrasses me. That's what I should have thought. I couldn't believe that God wanted it either. We didn't think much in the Air Corps of a fellow who wrangled a cushy job out of a CO by buttering him up. It was hard for me to believe that God thought much of a man who tried to wangle salvation by fulsome flattery. I should have thought the worship most pleasing to him was to do your best according to your lights. But that wasn't the chief thing that bothered me. I couldn't reconcile myself with the preoccupation with sin, which, so far as I could tell, was never entirely absent from the monk's thoughts. I'd known a lot of fellows in the Air Corps. Of course, they got drunk when they had a chance, and had a girl whenever they could, and used foul language. We had one or two bad hats. One fellow was arrested for passing rubber checks, and he was sent to prison for 6 months. It wasn't altogether his fault. He'd never had any money before, and when he got more than he'd ever dreamt of having, it went to his head. I'd known bad men in Paris, and when I got back to Chicago I knew more. But for the most part, their badness was due to heredity, which they couldn't help, or their environment, which they didn't choose. I'm not sure that society wasn't more responsible for their crimes than they were. If I'd been God, I couldn't have brought myself to condemn one of them, not even the worse, for eternal damnation. Father Ensheim was broad-minded. He thought that hell was the deprivation of God's presence. But if that is such an intolerable punishment that it can justly be called hell, can one conceive that a good God can inflict it? After all, he created men. If he so created them that it was possible for them to sin, it was because he willed it. If I trained a dog to fly at the throat of any stranger who came into my backyard, it wouldn't be fair to beat him when he did so. If an all-good and all-powerful God created the world, why did he create evil? The monk said that so man, by conquering the wickedness in him, by resisting temptation, by accepting pain and sorrow and misfortune as the trials sent by God to purify him, might at long last be made worthy to receive his grace. It seemed to me like sending a fellow with a message to some place, and just to make it harder for him, you constructed a maze that he had to get through, then dug a moat that he had to swim, and finally built a wall that he had to scale. I wasn't prepared to believe in an all-wise God who hadn't common sense. I didn't see why you shouldn't believe in a God who hadn't created the world, but had to make the best of a bad job he'd found. A being enormously better, wiser, and greater than man, who strove with the evil he hadn't made, and who you hoped might in the end overcome it. But on the other hand, I didn't see why you should. Those good fathers had no answers that satisfied either my head or my heart to the questions that perplexed me. My place was not with them. When I went to say goodbye to Father Ensheim, he didn't ask me whether I had profited by the experience in the way he had been so sure I would. He looked at me with inexpressible kindness. I'm afraid I've been a disappointment to you, Father, I said. No, he answered. You are a deeply religious man who doesn't believe in God. God will seek you out. You'll come back, whether here or elsewhere. Only God can tell.